Hello, hello. Testing, testing. If I'm over here at the computer, flipping through slides. Hello, hello, hello. I am testing the mic right now. Can everybody hear me? This is a good volume?
Yeah.
Does it sound okay? Yeah. Does it sound kind of weirdly tinny? Or is it fine?
It could be these
okay.
Speakers.
It sounds fine.
Okay, good.
Yep.
Great. Testing, testing. Does this sound okay?
Keep going.
Hi, Nikki. How are you? What did you have for breakfast?
What did I have for breakfast today? Coffee.
Coffee. No food? Oh. What did you have for lunch?
Chick-fil-A.
Ah.
Like my tactic is
You
to
made up
skip
for it.
breakfast and then eat extra throughout the day. It's very counterproductive.
Yeah, I get that. Good?
Yeah, very good.
Okay.
Very good. One, two, check. 1, 2, 1, 2.
1, 2, 3, A, B, C.
Speak in your regular voice. Yep.
Hi, my name is Arola, and okay.
Perfect.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for coming. Thank you for joining us here today, and welcome also to those of you who are joining us via the live stream. My name is Stephanie Georgakis-Abbott, and I'm the program director at UVA's Karsh Institute of Democracy. We're a pan-university institute that brings people together to generate ideas and solutions that build a better democracy for all. Through innovative programs, research, and partnerships, we help amplify and deepen the democracy-focused work across grounds and bring it out into the world. Today, we're excited to highlight one of our most innovative new initiatives, the Civic Cornerstone Fellowship, formerly known as the Student Dialogue Fellowship, which we piloted last year. The Civic Cornerstone Fellowship is designed to foster meaningful political dialogue among ideologically diverse UVA students. It equips them with the tools to engage constructively about today's most pressing issues. Over the next hour, you'll hear from Dr. Rachel Wall, whose research on political dialogue on college campuses was instrumental in shaping this program. She'll share findings from her work and explain how they informed the design of our fellowship. Following her talk, we'll be joined by two fellows from last year's cohort, and they'll help us reflect on their experiences and share what they learned. We'll conclude with time for your questions. So what sets this fellowship apart from other dialogue initiatives? The Civic Cornerstone Fellowship weaves together three essential components. We teach students peer-to-peer dialogic skills. We incorporate mindfulness and emotional regulation tools. And we give them a grounding in the American political landscape. Fellows meet regularly in small, ideologically diverse groups, often over shared meals, because it's very important to break bread together, to discuss current political topics while actively building listening skills and perspective taking. Our inaugural cohort included 300 undergraduate and graduate students, representing 11 of UVA's 12 schools and 14 countries. We're grateful to our many partners across grounds, including the College of Arts and Sciences, the Contemplative Sciences Center, the Darden School of Business, the Batten School, the School of Data Science, the School of Education and Human Development, Student Affairs, and the Public Service Pathways Program. The response to our program has been overwhelmingly positive. Since opening applications for this fall's cohort just over a month ago, we've already received hundreds of applications from students across disciplines and class years. Dozens of last year's fellows have even applied to participate once again. We look forward to continuing this program annually, and we're exploring opportunities to expand it to other campuses across Virginia and even nationally. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rachel Wall, an associate professor in the School of Education and the director of the Good Life Political Project at the Karsh Institute. She'll share insights from her research and discuss the upcoming evaluation of the Civic Cornerstone Fellowship.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us on this beautiful Saturday in Charlottesville. I want to extend a huge thank you to the Karsh Institute and Stephanie Georgakis-Abbott for sustaining and helping us build this program, and also to all of the families who are here today to help us to continue to build it. So I'm going to be going over pretty briefly the research I've been doing over the past decade on conversations across difficult divides, with a focus on studies I've done on college campuses. And then I'll speak a little bit about the fellowship that we've developed from this research. So when we think about having conversations about politics in schools and on university campuses, quite a lot of worries come up for quite a lot of people. And there are at least three worries that I see most frequently. The first is indoctrination. People across the political spectrum are worried that if teachers and professors encourage conversations about politics in classrooms, students will end up being indoctrinated with whatever the educator happens to believe, or with whatever the most persuasive students in the class happen to believe. The second worry is that we will blur lines that shouldn't be blurred. Not every question should be an open question. Not every norm or view should be open to deliberation. There are some basic principles of right and wrong and just and unjust that we don't want to have a dialogue about. We want to teach students. And so a lot of people worry that if we're having all of this dialogue and opening all these questions, we might be blurring lines that really shouldn't be blurred. And the third worry, and this one is a little bit more subtle, but just as pervasive, is that these conversations pretend something dangerous. They pretend that if we just get everyone into a room to talk, everyone's going to have a fair shot at being listened to, that we're in this level playing field. But actually what happens is that the people who are listened to outside of dialogue, because they sound the most educated, because of where they went to school and how they look and how they dress, they're the people who are going to be listened to in the dialogue room too. And so people who don't have those markers of status, but who may be just as rational and knowledgeable, are going to end up feeling exploited, right? Having a worse experience. So those worries are what made me start feeling really curious about what happens when people get together to try to understand each other across deep ideological divisions. As I said. So what I started doing is going to college campuses that were bringing together college students originally in the months after the 2016 presidential election, starting in early 2017 and continuing on throughout the years. And what these campuses were doing in the Northeast and the Southeast of the United States is asking students who voted for opposing candidates to sit down together and ask each other questions to try to understand why they had voted the way they did and what their views were on the political world. And I did not facilitate these conversations. I was just a researcher watching them. And then I would interview students who participated in the weeks afterward. And then every time I could, I followed up with them a couple years later and interviewed them again to understand what, if anything, these conversations had meant to them in the long run. I also teach classes on political dialogue here at UVA, and these classes have also shaped the way I think about dialogue. I teach classes both to third and fourth year students, as well as first year students through our engagements program, which is a first year curriculum for students. So I'm gonna cut to the chase of what I found out, which is what good can come of these conversations? Well, what doesn't happen is people, for the most part, don't persuade each other. Are you all shocked? People tend to not walk away thinking differently about the issues they care about most. But they do tend to walk away thinking very differently, or maybe a better word is feeling very differently about the people that they disagree with about those issues. And I saw this happen in a couple of different ways. So one is personalization, which basically means really getting a vivid sense that this person who in your mind had been a liberal or a Trump voter is this really particular person who actually has a good sense of humor and actually has a similar experience with, a small town that you grew up in as you do. This person, this particular person. The second is recognizing that even if you don't agree with them, they mean well. They have good intentions. Even if you think that their conclusions are wrong, they're actually not evil. And then the third, which is kind of the highest bar and the hardest to get to in these conversations, is being able to see not only is this a person I like, not only do they have good intentions, but there is actually some soundness, something sound, something I can recognize as moral, even though it's still not persuading me to vote differently. Like, I can see something legitimate in your moral orientation to the world, even though it does not persuade me that it should be mine. And these are the three processes I saw happen in the conversations that students had with one another. I'm just gonna give you a couple of examples so you can see what it looks like when I interviewed students. For example, one student said, "It changes how I view the opposing side. It puts a face to it. It gives me someone I know." And an example of recognizing that someone means well is a student who says, at times, when I read the 3 people in my news feed that are super pro-Trump, I'm livid. I'm so mad at these people, so disgusted by these people. It's very easy for me to write on Facebook, any idiot who supports this immigration ban is a total idiot, or something like that kind of icky crap that you read on Facebook. What I really liked about this dialogue is I sat with these 4 kids, and I realized they weren't very engaged with the stuff we were trying to figure out. They certainly weren't monsters. They certainly didn't deserve to be called fascists or assholes or idiots or Nazis or whatever. I do think that empathy is huge. I find myself defending the other side a little bit differently. Like now, when I'm out in the real world, these kids were all about abortion. That's the only thing they talked about. I said, look, regardless of what we think about the immigration ban, we have to acknowledge that there are single-issue voters, and for those people, if they legitimately think that Hillary, you can see this was after the 2016 election, if they legitimately think that Hillary was a baby killer, if that's the case, we can't really assume that they support everything Trump's doing or did. That was the good part of the dialogue. I think it was just that empathy. So you can see that he stops short of really recognizing the soundness of the other side, right? He hasn't come to a deeper sense of respect. He recognizes that they're people and they have good intentions. But it takes a little bit more to get to that higher bar of respect, right? Of recognizing not only do they have good intentions, but there's something here that I can recognize as a moral source that makes sense to me. And so an example of that is this next student, who I asked him, who did you learn the most from in the conversation? And he said, probably the girl I mentioned, who responded with the reasons why she voted for Clinton and why she was with the party she was with. I learned a lot from her. I'm a little ashamed to realize that my presuppositions were that liberals are supporting their ideas from a position of hate or social control. Obviously, I'm sure there's some people at all levels that maybe do think that way, but on the ground, I would imagine there's more people than I expected who are thinking positively and really have high ideals and aspirations. So what I found that surprised me a little bit was that for the students who were able to get to this place of respecting the other's moral source, rather than just saying, okay, I see you're a good person, but maybe you made a bad choice, was being able to understand the deeper reasons for their disagreement. So often when we get together for dialogue, we try to rush to common ground. And common ground is good. It's good to find common ground with people. We should still do that. But the problem with that is if we find common ground, we realize we share values, but that person still votes differently than us, it's hard not to think that maybe they're just not well informed, or maybe they're crazy, or maybe they're just not very good people. And it was when students were able to dig more deeply to understand what is different about your experience of being a person in the world. What is it that you're afraid of, or that you hope for, or that you care about, or that you believe in, that makes this choice look different for you? When they were able to dig into that, that is often what allowed students to develop that respect in the difference. Now, when I followed up with these students 3 to 5 years later, I found, one, that what they had learned, what they had walked away with initially, held consistently over time, in that many students didn't even remember what they had talked about, like the topic of their conversation, but they often remembered who they had talked to. They remembered, I sat with that guy who was really funny and a really good person. For example, there was one student who remembered, he was a conservative student who was deeply concerned, committed to the pro-life movement. And during the Supreme Court, during the Senate hearings for the Supreme Court Justice, Amy Coney Barrett, I asked him, have you thought about the dialogue since it happened? And he said, yeah, I have. And I said, what have you thought about? And he said, I thought about that guy I spoke with at the dialogue, and I remembered that he was a really good guy and he asked really good questions. And I wondered, what is he thinking of all this? And he had remembered a liberal student who was pro-choice. And so it caused him to, in a moment of significant national division, have a question about how someone who deeply disagreed with him was experiencing the same event, wondering what he thought about it. So it put him in a position of curiosity rather than defensiveness or anger. I'm going to go through this a little quickly to make sure we have time for our conversation and questions. But what I also found is that for a small number of students, over time, their learning deepened. So you remember the student who said, listen, I sat with those 4 innocent kids and I realized they weren't very engaged with the stuff we were talking about. As he continued over the years to reflect on the dialogue, when I interviewed him again 3 years later, he realized that if he held the belief that those students he spoke with held, that he too might have voted differently. That if he believed what they believed about when life begins, about when a life becomes a life, then he too might be a single issue voter, right? That he too might have made the same choice. So over the years, as he continued to think about it, he became more willing to admit the soundness of a view that he still disagrees with, right? That he doesn't change his view, he changes his willingness to acknowledge the soundness of the opposing side. So there were a very, very small number of students who did actually, over time, change their political party affiliation and their views on particular issues. But for no student was this just because of the dialogue. No student walked into the dialogue and went out and changed their party affiliation or their vote. It happened in a couple of ways. And one of them was when students felt that they were hearing something articulated that better described some intuition they had that they hadn't quite been able to put into words. And this is actually how the philosopher Charles Taylor describes what reasoning really is. So Taylor says, the task of reasoning is not to disprove some radically opposed first premise, like killing people is no problem. We're not trying to convince someone of something that they do not believe already, but rather to show how the policy is unconscionable on premises which both sides accept and cannot but accept. So when we're reasoning with someone, what we're really doing is trying to invite them to see our view as a better expression of what they already value, not trying to change their values, right? And this is what I saw happen. So for example, Bianca, a student, said, I asked her when I followed up with her 3 years later, did that dialogue change anything for you? And she said, I think it did, because for once I had to really have a stand. Because everyone was saying, I'm for this and I'm against this. And they were able to say it so plainly, and I had never really done that. I'm finally owning up to my own views. Some people are like, where is this coming from? But I feel like it's always been on my mind. I just didn't have the words for it almost, and now I finally do. Now, it wasn't only to appealing to shared ethics that students changed when they did, and again, this was a small number of students who actually shifted in their political views. But it was when students were asked questions sincerely and respectfully and with curiosity that they began to ask themselves questions. Now, most students who began to ask themselves questions deepened and clarified their political commitments that they already had. But for a small number of students, they then later went on to have powerful life experiences that shifted the way they felt about a political issue. And then they thought back to that conversation, to that dialogue, that had started to prompt them to ask questions, and then started to develop different answers for themselves. So for example, one student, I asked her 3 years later, have you thought about that dialogue since it happened? And she says, yeah, the one at Penn. I've been thinking about that one the most because I remember the conversations we had at my table and how that was really the first time someone directly questioned me, like, why are you going to vote the way you are if you say you believe this or you say you believe that? And it wasn't an attacking question. It was just, I was taken aback because I really had to think about my answer and think, yeah, why am I voting the way I am? And she says, I do think about that conversation specifically a lot, and just that question of, if you believe this, why are you voting the way you are? Even though that's a very general question, thinking, okay, if I believe in rights for those seeking asylum, why am I going to vote either way for Biden or Trump? So this was in 2020. So what I did find as well, and I'll say this quickly so we can move on to the fellowship, is that some of the concerns that people have about these conversations came to fruition for some students, and some of these concerns didn't. You might recall that I said that a lot of people are worried about blurring lines that shouldn't be blurred. I did not see that happen in these conversations, right? So students didn't walk away saying, I don't know, it just seems all too gray. I don't think I can make any political judgments anymore. I think I'm going to sit out the next election. Instead, students felt galvanized to learn more and understand better and be more engaged, and often felt clarified in their commitments. However, I did find that students whose rights were in jeopardy, so students whose rights were threatened by policy proposals of the other side, did have an especially difficult experience in these conversations, because they felt that the juxtaposition between this person who is being kind to me here in this room at this table is also at the same time voting in a way that makes me less safe physically, literally, or my family less safe physically, literally. So for example, a student who I interviewed when the Trump administration had announced the ban on immigration from some Muslim-majority countries, a student whose family had immigrated to the US from a Muslim-majority country in West Africa, said, it was tough because they made the dialogue into games, and she was referring to the icebreaker at the beginning. It allowed for a lot of giggling and trying to have fun when it was a very serious issue for some people in the room. That was hard because there were all of these other emotions of, this is affecting me already. So it can be an alienating experience to feel like this is, to use an expression, a kind of academic exercise for everyone else. But for me, I'm afraid that I am going to not be able to be here anymore because of what we're talking about. I'm afraid that I'm less safe because of what we're talking about. And that was a very difficult experience. So from these interviews, I created a set of guidelines that I drew on as I worked with the Karsh Institute to develop the Civic Cornerstone Fellowship. And these guidelines are what we based many of the program components on. And I'm going to go through them somewhat quickly, but I'm happy to talk about them in the question and answer session. The first is, given the hopes and the fears that people have about these conversations and the difficulties that some students encounter in them, it can be very helpful in a formal conversation. Obviously, this won't work if you're talking at Thanksgiving dinner, so to speak, but in a formal conversation, to start out saying co-creating norms. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, getting people together and saying, what do we want from this? Like, what do we most hope for? And how do we need to interact in order to get it? And also, really importantly, what do we do if what we're afraid is gonna happen happens? Let's talk about it now. If someone says something that's devastating to you, what do you want to happen next? And working that out beforehand was very helpful. Second, practicing listening, because it's a skill that we don't get rewarded for in most of our lives, especially in school, indirectly but not directly. So actually having students do listening exercise where they practice that at the beginning. Encouraging and model curiosity. So moderators, facilitators that ask questions and themselves model being curious across ideological views about how people understand the answers. Getting personal about politics. So it's very, very easy to have a political conversation where people are essentially engaging in fact wars, and nobody cares because no one's persuaded by someone else's facts right now. So really digging into, what is this issue about for you? How did it come to matter and why? What are your personal hopes and fears that make this issue matter so much? Digging into disagreements, as I say, is so important for deepening or even just planting a seed of respect for understanding how someone could walk away with such a different experience of the world than you have. Self-regulation techniques for students who are having strong emotional reactions and significant difficulty in these conversations. And selecting for both diversity and connection. So we often, when we have these conversations, our instinct is to just make every small group as diverse as possible. Just throw everyone together so everyone gets as much difference as they can. But when I interviewed students who had an especially difficult time in these conversations, often what they said was, well, it was okay because when I looked into her eyes, I knew she understood. And so creating small discussion groups where, yes, you want that ideological diversity, but also giving similarly positioned students an opportunity to connect with one another is really important for supporting students who might have a more difficult time in these conversations. So you have both difference and connection. From this, we developed the Civic Cornerstone Fellowship, which we are so excited to talk about in just a moment, with 3 primary features. The first is peer-to-peer interactions, and this is the heart of the fellowship. Students meet every 3 weeks in ideologically diverse groups to ask each other questions for the sake of understanding, focusing on understanding each other's histories, concerns, hopes, clarifying the nature of disagreement, and discovering what they share. The second, as I said, is self-regulation techniques such as mindfulness exercises so that they're able to stay present for the conversation. And the third is knowledge acquisition, because we're a university, and so we're drawing on our resources in what we do best, which is providing information. And so we have students meet in small groups with faculty who think differently about the American political landscape, both to give them actual information, but also to model how those differences can look in respectful disagreement. And with that, I am so excited to welcome back to the stage Stephanie, the Director of Programming at Karsh, and 2 phenomenal students who recently completed the fellowship in its inaugural year, Arola and Terry. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Rachel. I think it's safe to say that those guidelines are not just applicable for students, but definitely something I think we can all use more of in our lives. So Terry and Arola, I want to thank you for joining us. And I want to start just by asking you to introduce yourselves and give a little bit of context about why you were interested in the fellowship, what was most attractive to you when you saw the opportunity come up.
Sure, yeah, I can start. I actually just graduated like 2 weeks ago. Thank you. I majored in foreign affairs and I minored in studio art. My name is Arola, for anyone who didn't catch that. I'm from Northern Virginia. And definitely what drew me to the program, I had just come back from my semester abroad, my 3rd year in Paris, and I was ready for my 4th year on grounds. My last year, I really wanted to make it count. So I was really, really eager to just be involved in as many activities as possible. But I also really wanted something that wasn't going to be just in my traditional like classroom, like academic setting. And so I was really excited about like the aspect of dialogue, like with my fellow students, being able to have the opportunity to learn from my peers, because I think that's something that sometimes is taken for granted. I like a lot of times to not just learn from like formal instruction, but from people in my classrooms and people who are the same age as me. And so I think that's what drew me to the program, and just that opportunity to have a different experience for my 4th year. And it didn't disappoint, so very thankful.
Terry, tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you again for inviting me here. Name is Terry Thornton. I'm a Posse veteran here at UVA. So after spending many years in the military, retired, got selected to come to UVA as a veteran student. And I just really, what attracted me to the program was more so being a part and being at the table where differences could actually, talk in a safe space. Being in the military, I've had the opportunity to serve under different administrations, and a lot of stuff that we talked about where you have differences of opinion, we have to learn to put that aside for, it's about the mission first. So being in an academic setting, I had definitely the honor, with Dr. Wall, to be in her class in the engagement class, as well as being in the dialogue. So I saw it from both perspectives, very young students as well as more of the students from all around campus. So it allowed me to look at it from a different perspective and offer my perspective from a non-traditional student, and just kind of be a part of seeing how differences would basically play out in those settings. Just like when you was talking about earlier, where you have some people who come to the dialogue and they stuck on like, I believe it's this way, and hearing it from, I guess, myself, that's non-traditional student that's actually lived it, been in the world, giving them a different perspective. It was different. It was interesting to see how they actually accepted that, and a lot of times their views would kind of, not really change, but they would be more open to understanding what was going on, and that's why I'd really enjoy being a part of it.
That's great. I'm curious, something you said, Terry, made me think. I'm curious if there's something each of you could share, maybe that surprised you, or something that you weren't expecting that you came away from the program with.
You want to go first?
Totally. I think I wasn't ready for just the very unique dynamic that kind of came out of the fellowship. It was just, I was trying to find the words to describe it on the way over here, and I'm still struggling to find the language, but it was like somehow informal, I guess, but also very genuine, very authentic. We were able to like lock in and like be serious when we needed to. Like 1 second we'd be like talking about a meme, and then like the next second we'd be like debating DEI. So it was just a very unique dynamic for, again, like people my age, students who either are or aspire to be civically engaged, civically informed, politically informed, but we're also just like college students at the same time. So I think we were the only ones who kind of understood how to have that conversation in the way that we had it. We were the only ones who knew how to like kind of speak to each other, and so I think I wasn't anticipating that interesting, those two simultaneous factors, but it created something really beautiful. And yeah, I think we all left with like a very special bond from the time that we shared there, because it was an experience like no other. So yeah, I don't think I was expecting that.
Terry, what about you?
Okay, so I had to write down my two topics. So the interesting thing was last semester, the end of course dialogue was basically, I think it was more edgy than anything we had throughout the entire semester. And in Dr. Wall class, we kind of led with that, and it was different, seeing the differences of opinion of some of the younger students versus some of the more seasoned students in their view. And it was like, I think we talked about it one time, it was more of a safe space. Nobody really wanted to kind of like ruffle feathers and kind of go hard left or hard right, but in the engagement class, it was like, it was different. It was quite different, because I think a lot of the students like kind of bring in a lot of their views from their environments in which they come, parents' views, and it was just different to see how they kind of changed over time from the first day of class to the last day of class.
That's really interesting. Rachel, I'm curious if you can kind of reflect more broadly on something Terry raised, of like, how do you see this in different classroom dynamics? So we've talked about the engagements class, that's first years, versus students that are maybe a little more mature in their academic career. Any insights on those different contexts?
Yeah, I strongly agree with Terry that every group is different in the dynamic that emerges, and anyone who's been in a classroom probably already knows that a really different dynamic emerges. And I think particularly when it comes to this piece of, to what extent are people willing to voice their disagreements early on, and to what extent do you really need to scaffold it? I think that piece is especially different. And depending on the class, there are classes I've taught where there are a few students who are really outspoken, or maybe even one student who's really outspoken, and that ends up igniting other students to respond. And so there's not a lot I have to do to get those disagreements to surface because they do on their own. There are other classes I've taught, such as this semester, my upper level class, although I agree with you about the engagements class, so that was interesting to hear from your perspective. My upper level class students were very reticent to share their views. And so I had to do a lot more scaffolding. I gave many more opportunities for students to express their views without identifying them. So, writing their, what is one question you have about this issue or view you have of this issue that you don't feel comfortable right now saying out loud? Write it on the note card, shuffle the note cards, right? I think this was our facilitator, Annie Rappaport's realization in one of the dialogue sessions,
right,
that this was going to be important. So finding ways for students to be able to express their views without having to own them. We're asking questions like, can anyone think of a counter argument to this? Can anyone think of another way to look at this? So you don't need to claim it as your own, but maybe you could imagine it, is more important in some classes.
Rachel, has this more broadly changed how you approach teaching?
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm far more attentive, even in the classes I teach that aren't about political dialogue, to the social dynamics of conversation, to the ways in which group dynamics can inhibit or support an honest expression of and exploration of an issue, and thinking about how do I put groups together who are really going to be able to learn from and with each other, and how do I structure activities so that students are going to be able to look at this issue for real and ask honest questions.
Great. So, Arola and Terry, I'm curious, Arola, congratulations, you just graduated.
Thank you.
Terry, you have another year left here at UVA. How do you think about is there something you learned through the dialogue fellowship that you have either already applied in a different context, or you kind of could see how you could apply it, Arola, as you go out into the world and start your career? Terry, as you're engaging with other students on grounds or in other classrooms, how has it helped you outside of the fellowship, if at all?
This might sound obvious, but I think critical thinking, it's obviously something that is necessary in every aspect, educational, professional, or otherwise, relationships, everything. But I think just that idea of why do I feel the way I feel about something, and why do I have these preconceived notions? I think it's very common to just trust your instincts and to just trust, my gut reaction to this policy issue or to this stance or to whatever it may be is, my gut issue is right, because why else would I be feeling that way? But when you actually stop and think, why is that my knee-jerk reaction to something, or why do I have these deep-rooted convictions about a hot-button issue? Was I raised that way? Have there been external influences or pressures? Or is this even me that's speaking right now, or am I just parroting everyone that I've ever been around? That was some sometimes tough but necessary self-reflection that happened. It doesn't, discredit some other things that you might still, some other values that you might still hold true, just because you reflect on some things, I guess it doesn't mean that all the other things are out the window. But I think some people maybe are just a little scared to stop and question things for a second, because it might cause ruptures in their identity and things that they've held for a while. So yeah, I think just that reflection and that critical thinking, and just being able to have those tough questions and conversations with yourself is something that I hope to apply, and something that I'm glad I did, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Terry, what about you?
So I really do appreciate the dialogue. It created a safe space to actually be able to talk. And I think that the media does a a great job of pushing these false narratives. But if we can get out of that box and just interact with each other, no matter the side or the opposing views, I think you have very engaging conversations. Recently, I was in the grocery store, and you know how sometimes the media portrayed a certain thing, like somebody with a MAGA hat, you know, may look at somebody, you know, of color and may have disagreements. But me and this gentleman had the most engaging and interesting conversation standing in that line. And I think, you know, because of being open to dialogue, being open to opposing views from somebody else, you know, it allowed me to not go in just thinking that, you know, he may feel some kind of way about me or him feeling the same way about myself standing in line. So even though we're doing this in an academic setting, I think this could be something that could be applied just, you know, on a broader scale to open up, you know, dialogue just amongst people to, you know, we're all human. So we can sit and just have, you know, a conversation with somebody without, you know, throwing blows. So
Yeah.
I really do.
That's great. So we're going to transition to Q&A in just a second. So if you have any questions for our panel here, but before we do, one last question to the three of you, a lightning round, and try to limit it to one. A piece of advice that you would give to anybody here that may want to navigate conversations on their own as you know they go back out into the world, into their lives with somebody that has an opposing political view. Rachel, let's start with you.
The hardest thing for me is to pause my burning desire to persuade them and to first be curious. Because I really have seen that nobody listens to someone else unless they're first listened to, and they can feel when the listening is genuine. So find your curiosity.
Good one. Terry, what about you?
She kind of stole my thunder.
Sorry.
Because I was going to say, you know, being an active listener, and I learned that in our class, being an active listener before you already take your stance or say, you know, this is what I believe and this is my stance. Be an active listener first, and then you can kind of, you know, pose your dialogue or the discussion.
Mine is one that I'm also stealing from someone, but it's from my dad. He's always telling us me and my siblings, to learn how to disagree, but without being disagreeable. And I think that if you just take a second and just consider the idea that you're not going to battle with someone that you're disagreeing with, and prioritize emotional intelligence, prioritize empathy, like they said, listening, some of the legitimization tactics that you mentioned earlier. If you prioritize those things first, other than, you know, I'm about to go talk to someone who I know I'm going to disagree with, I think just having that idea that you don't want to be disagreeable would help a lot.
I think those are three really good pieces of advice. Thank you. So we have 2 mics in the room. Mary Beth and Luke have mics. If anybody has any questions, just raise your hand, and the closest one will find you. Luke, we can start up here.
I can project, so I don't necessarily need the mic. Kudos to you guys. My name's Terry Gray. Good name.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Class of 1995. You know, back then we had started a group called SUPRA, Students United. Thank you. To promote racial awareness. And we tried to structure it between conservative and liberal, male and female, and other, and closed door sessions where you could exchange ideas and views about really controversial, you know, topics, controversial back then, and what was said there stayed there. It sounds very similar to the model. We saw progress, we saw evolution. The people who were there were largely self-selected. They had the interest in coming. They were kind of curious and open-minded, and a lot of the need for it was spawned because at the time I felt like there weren't those discussions happening on grounds as much so. So my question to you guys is, because I don't know at this point, you know, not plugged in that kind of way, to what extent on grounds, like sort of in the larger university, do you guys see an interest? Are these conversations happening or permitted to happen, right, outside of what you've created and what you're doing here?
I might jump in just first very quickly and then throw it to everybody else. I will just say that I think, you know, I'll cite back to our interest from the first cohort in the first year. We honestly, based on previous things we had done, we had prepared to have a few dozen students sign up for this. And we were shocked and overwhelmed when we had 300 applications. Students didn't get paid to do this. There was no credit. This was purely because they wanted to do it. And we figured out a way to accommodate the program and make it be able to accept everybody that applied. And I think I'll speak for myself, what I have become very aware of is that there is a huge demand from students for this type of space. They want this type of structured space. And I think that is being met with supply. So this is just one, we've worked very hard to create partnerships across grounds to have this opportunity open to undergraduate and graduate students. And that cohort included medical school students, law school students, people that have very, very busy lives, and they still showed up for 2 hours every 3 weeks because they're really hungry for this. And I think this is happening across grounds. I think there's a lot of demand and the supply is catching up. But I'm curious what you all think.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just to that point of supply and demand, I think that demand also comes from the desire for this kind of space, this kind of civilized space. Because to your question, a lot of times things that I've seen outside of formal, like setting like this, or like what you were talking about that you had facilitated, is a lot more inflammatory. There's a lot more anger behind it. People are a lot of times having these discussions in like social settings, and sometimes there's like drinks involved. So it just gets like it strays away from the intent of the conversation very quickly. So I think a lot of students, myself included, just wanted that space where it wasn't some offhand comment that someone's replying to and then it suddenly starts some kind of political conversation, but it was intentional, it was respectful, and it's a place where different ideas are encouraged, but underneath that understanding that we're all here to understand and respect each other. So I think students wanted that controlled environment, because outside of here, what's been happening and what's probably going to happen in the future, outside of these things, it's not very enjoyable conversations going on. And it's about the same topics, just in worse formats. So.
Okay, for myself, I want to say I think that we had 4 veteran students a part of it, and that's pretty big since we only have 40 veteran students here on grounds. But for us, in that veteran space, sometimes those conversations can get really, really edgy. And I think that coming to an academic setting, learning how to navigate those dialogues and those discussions was key for the ones of us that chose to be a part of it. And going back to that question, I think that in a lot of spaces, learning your TTPs, which your tactics and procedures of how to navigate in those spaces, was one of the things I think that I took away from this dialogue. And saying we started with 300 students, so if those 300 students can go out and learn those tactics and procedures in those spaces, then you can have a lot safer and open dialogue in those spaces. So I guess I'm looking at it as it can actually just grow, and basically sending out somebody to I guess have those dialogues without them getting to the point where they're leading to like kind of big blowouts.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Oh, yep, there's somebody.
Hello, I'm Vicki Dudley from class of '85, and I think there were 2 tenets on your slide of the things that you taught students, one being active listening, the other being diffusing negative emotions. And I'm wondering if there's been any dialogue about offering that to all students, which is important in home life, work life, political life, etc.
Life. I don't know. I know that there are a lot of efforts across grounds from places like Who's Connected and Who's Well to try to integrate that kind of support. It might be interesting to hear from the 2 of you about whether you got that kind of work from other places on grounds, particularly in your first year or throughout your time?
I don't think so. If in terms of like that mindfulness and kind of, yeah, I just think it's an afterthought, honestly. I don't think it's necessarily a priority in a lot of my classes. A lot of times it's just like a focus on the curriculum. I don't think any of the instructors I had would have ever like rejected any propositions towards that if the conversation was steered in that direction. But I don't think it was necessarily like promoted or enforced or anything, which is unfortunate, except, I'm thinking as I'm talking, except maybe in some of my art classes, because reflection is like literally part of the curriculum. Like after every project, like we have critiques. And so, you know, all my art classes were based around dialogue, whether it was like sculpture or drawing or even studio art. It was centered around dialogue, centered around reflection, around collaboration, around community, so exchanging ideas. So upon second thought, in the arts, and that's it.
And I'm going to have to say, not at all, besides the engagement classes.
And I do think to that point, we are, as we're thinking about expanding this program, we're thinking about what it looks like to scale it and make it easier to disseminate to not only every student who's interested, but people outside of the walls of the university as well. So I think there was a question back there, and then we'll go up front. Okay.
Not totally a question, but I found that communication is important in any relationships that we have. And I found it, we started reading a book called Nonviolent Communication. And the point's made that you need to be a good listener, and you need to do a little background and find the commonality. I think most all of us, and you probably will agree with this, have learned to debate, to come out the winner, to have the last word, and that's kind of ingrained in a lot of us. Most of the times we're not always listening to people as trying to think of, what am I going to say to that? And solutions aren't found that way. Nobody comes out a winner. In reading this book, there was one point made, and I just look at it as FFWR. State of fact, the feeling, why? And then if there's a request, you know, add that on at the end. But the most important part is the listening, and it goes through everything. So your point's well made to have discussions that don't turn into arguing matches, to be on common ground. The commonality of us all, I think, are very well made. And it would be helpful if you did share this with more, not just in the political realm, but all students.
That's great. Thank you.
And faculty.
Thank you for that feedback. So we have just a few minutes left. I saw two hands, so maybe we'll go Nicole, and then we'll go up to the front. Mary Beth, there's a question up front. And then, so let's ask both questions, and then we'll answer them together.
Thank you for a great presentation, Nicole Penn, class of 2015. I'm curious about how the topics were selected for these dialogues. Was this something that Karsh, you guys decided this seems to be the most pressing issues on grounds, or did this come from the students themselves? Did they set the agenda, so to speak?
It's a great question. We'll take the second question, then we'll answer them together. Mary Beth, right up here in the white.
Hi, my name is Faye Brandon, and my daughter is a 2020 graduate of UVA, Dr. Sabrina Ritz. And I wanted to commend all you guys on having the open dialogue. I think that's really great. And I am a high school teacher. And so what I wanted to comment on is that the students, the generation that's coming now, they are very outspoken. And I guess my colleagues and I, what we find is that they have no filters. And so what's challenging to us, which we love that they are open to communicate, and sometimes we have to shape and mold what they say. But what we find is that that can be a challenge because they are so open and with their dialogue, and they're so outspoken and they don't have filters. So I guess my question is, do you all have any recommendations or advice that as a high school students, they won't have any problems with the communicating, but we want them to be able to do it professionally, you know, in the correct setting?
That's a great question. Rachel, I'll just say very quickly on the first one, and if you want to add to it, we polled incoming students on some of the issues that they wanted to talk about. And I think, you know, we didn't necessarily cite it, but just for context, this was happening in the fall. So students met before and after the election, which provided its own set of topics for the students to talk about as well. Any answers to that?
And in addition to the polling, many of the questions are structured so that the issues that are important to any particular students can come up. So a lot of the questions are things like, what issue matters the most to you and why? So that students can surface whatever it is they really care about that week. So we try to ground it as much as possible in what the students really care about. And then I love this question, and I love that your students are outspoken. I think it's probably easier to start there than it is to try to get people to care. So I love that. I think, you know, one phrase that comes to my mind often is from someone named Tony Layden, who says that we can offer reasons as invitations. And if we can talk to our students about, you know, maybe you want to go to a party, but if someone commands you to go to a party, you're probably not going to want to go. You want to be invited to go to a party. So how do you invite someone into your view? What does it mean to invite someone? What does it mean to offer your reasons as invitations? And maybe have them brainstorm that. Like, what would it look like to command someone with your view, and what would it look like to invite them into your view? And like, do it with, you know, what flavor ice cream do you like first, right? So that they can practice taking different approaches to disagreement. Because, you know, high school students are so smart, they'll figure it out.
Thank you. Well, Rachel, Terry, Rolla, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for participating in the program this year. And Rachel, thank you for being our partner in this for all of your deep research on it. I think it's safe to say that your work is changing the experience for students here at UVA and beyond. So thank you, and thank you all, and I hope you're having a wonderful reunion weekend.
Thank you.